Pleasants. Well, thank you so much for taking time out from your busy schedule to talk to me this morning. I wonder, Dr. Pleasants, can you tell me when you first became involved in oral history and why you thought oral history was an important medium?
When I was in graduate school, I was working on my dissertation, and I was working on a Southern politician named Bob Reynolds, and who was a rather unusual individual. He was a Southern isolationist, but also a New Dealer, which is, in Southern political terms, rather unusual. And so I was trying to find out what motivated him and why he had become an isolationist. And he was chairman of the Military Affairs Committee during World War II, which is not a good thing. So at that point, I really needed to learn about his thought processes and why he made some of the votes he made. And so that's when I first started doing oral history, trying to understand this guy's mindset. And then I did a book on the 1950 election in North Carolina, a rather well-known election between a very liberal Frank Graham and a very conservative opponent. And a lot of people were still alive who had participated in that election. And the key to that book, I think, was interviewing all of these people who were campaign managers, who were in the press. And for the first time, I began to realize how significant the information is when you get a great cross-section of people from both sides. Who one of the people I interviewed was Jesse Helms, who was a supporter, obviously, of the more conservative candidate Willis Smith. And so to get both sides, both perspectives, enabled me to get a more balanced overview of this very emotional and race-oriented election. So that's when I really began to understand the value of oral history, understanding that it's not always reliable and that people's memories are sometimes inaccurate. But if you have the facts and you know the specifics of events and you can get enough people, you can really reconstruct what happened. And if you have a good system of eliciting information, I think it works very well.
Over the years, did you have, or have you had role models, people that you think do outstanding oral histories that you kind of try to emulate or to work off of?
Well, I guess the one person that was so influential was Studs Terkel, and particularly his book on World War II and Division Street. I thought he did a fine job, again, of getting the mood of the time and the thoughts of the people. Interview, again, enough people from different walks of life. I think that gives you, again, this broad overview. So I think in some ways he popularized it to the point where a lot of people in America begin to realize how significant oral history could be. So I've always sort of thought of Studs Terkel as the one person who made oral history popular in the United States. There are many others, obviously, that have followed his footsteps over the years, but I always thought of him as the one person who at least got me more interested in oral history and publications. I mean, prior to that, I'd used it mainly as a research tool, but then I realized that you can base entire books on oral history interviews.
Dr. Pleasants, when you first arrived at the University of Florida, Samuel Proctor was directing the oral history program. Can you talk about your reflections and your interactions with Professor Proctor?
Sam was a very influential member of the Department of History, but more so he was an individual who was heavily involved in university activities. And at the time that I came, he had just started. He started in 1967 the oral history program here. I came in 1969, so he had just started. But he had organized not only oral history, but the Florida Historical Quarterly, which he had, and he had a Center for Florida Studies. And he was, I think, very influential in the early days in encouraging me to do research and writing on Florida history. And over a period of time, as he developed the oral history program, I became more interested in oral history. Now, his beginning was essentially interviewing people at the university. That was the thrust of his time in oral history. So much of that information was not useful to me per se, since I was not writing about universities. But I understood the potential, as he did, of this program. The problem he had was he had, I think, one full-time secretary and maybe one or two graduate students, and didn't have any money to speak of, and you know, everybody was in one office, and it was really kind of cramped. And he had all these other activities he was working on, so he didn't have the time or the resources to develop the oral history to the potential it had even during this time. And remember, this is pretty early. You know, there were not too many oral history programs in the nation at that time. And the biggest coup he had is he got a Doris Duke grant to do interviews with Southeastern Indians. And that's a huge, very valuable collection. And just recently, I have used the interviews with the Seminole Indians, and have worked with Harry Kersey, and we've just finished a book on the Seminole Indians. And those interviews are priceless. Nobody had done that, particularly with the Seminoles, who, as you know, don't even really have much of an oral tradition in terms of their history. They do in terms of their culture. And so by going and talking to them, and Tom King, who was working here at the time, he went and lived with them for a year. And so these interviews are just absolutely priceless. And so I think that was a step he took that brought the program to a different level of achievement and recognition around the country.
So Dr. Pleasants, when you arrived here in 1969 and Samuel Proctor had already really started kind of creating the oral history program, when did you begin to really get involved in that program? It
was really not until the 1990s, and Sam was at the point where he was ready to retire. And someone was trying to determine what would happen to the Center for Florida Studies, what would happen to the Florida Historical Quarterly, what would happen with oral history. It turned out ultimately that the Florida Historical Quarterly went from here to the University of Central Florida. So we lost that about that time. And so there was a great concern that somebody needed to take over the oral history program and try to expand it. So I started in about 1995 talking to the history department, talking to the dean, and talking to Sam, and finally decided that it was something I wanted to do. So I was appointed director in 1996. And as I recall, I had been on, I think, a 3-year term, which was renewable. And so now this is I started in 96, so this is really the 11th year that I've been with the program. And I think that's probably a pretty good time to be with the program. I think it's like almost being like a president of a university. 10 years is probably enough. And so once they talked to me about it and I looked at the potential, and by 1990s, of course, oral history has become much more popular around the country. More people are interested in it, more people are willing to give money to support it. And I just saw at a university this size, a state this size, with all the potential for interviews and information, I said, boy, this could be a really wonderful opportunity. And so I agreed to serve as director. And I'm really pleased I did. It was good for me. It was a new direction. You get sort of tired of doing the same thing year after year after year. And so this enabled me to delve into fields and things that I knew absolutely nothing about. And it's been, for me, it's been an incredible education. Learning about Florida business leaders, politics, federal judges, Seminole Indians, water management, all of these things, Everglades restoration that I knew virtually nothing about and had to sit down and become familiar with all of this information. And so I found it both challenging and interesting.
Dr. Pleasants, you've used the collection and you've done oral histories to write some very important books. A book on the 2000 presidential election in Florida. And can you talk about the process of writing those books and doing the oral histories that became those books?
Yeah, so far I've done 4, and we just mentioned the Seminole book. The first one was on Orange journalism, and that was at the behest of the Florida Press Association. They came to me and said, we would like to do an oral history of Florida newspapers. And so they gave us a grant, and I went around the state and interviewed sports writers, editorial writers, all kinds of people like Carl Hyacin, who is both a columnist and an author, and ended up setting up the book with an introduction talking about Florida journalism, and then in the context of Florida journalism had edited interviews with, let's just say, a broad array of Florida journalists, and Carl Hyacin would have been one of them. And so that way each interview was separate and had to do with a different aspect of journalism. Some were publishers, some were editors, some were just writers. A couple of them had won Pulitzer Prizes. I did one on editorial cartoonist. I did one on a sports writer. And so it was kind of a broad array of journalists in the state of Florida. And I thought that was absolutely fascinating to get a backstage view of how newspapers are organized and how they're run and how they're edited. And the second book was through the university. They realized that this was such an important vote in 2000 that they gave us some money to go out and do interviews. And I ended up interviewing 43 people, again, lawyers both sides, journalists, the election supervisor, judges, one Supreme Court justice, all kinds of people who were involved in this election. And in this case did the same sort of thing, rather lengthy introduction to what happened in that recount, and then a series of interviews, some with the press, some with the judges, some with the lawyers, same kind of format. And then the third book was on the University of Florida, and in this case, very similar. Proctor had done interviews with, 250 people at the university. So once again, I did a couple of presidents. I did some the dean of women, early dean of women, and some illustrious graduates, same sort of thing, same kind of format, an introduction to history of the university, and then a series of interviews of football coach Ray Graves. So again, sort of a diverse view of the history of the University of Florida. And then finally, the last book we mentioned was the Seminole Indians. And this is a different style book. This is not edited interviews. It is a socio-economic, cultural history of the tribe and how it's changed from 1970 to 2000. So it's not edited interviews. It's a reasonably coherent evolution of of their history. And so one chapter has to do with economic change, and one chapter has to do with religion and health, and that sort of thing. So I found that the resources were so rich that they should be used. And you know, the resources here are so great, you could write 15 books. You could go in there and pull from all of these interviews and just keep writing book after book after book. There's that much information in here. And I think that's what the great contribution is of this collection. I mean, a lot of people have started using this collection, writing all kinds of books. And obviously that's what we want. We want people to use these resources.
Dr. Pleasants, you mentioned that the strength, or some of the, part of the strength of the collection is in many interviews done with Seminole Indians, with university figures. What are some of the other strengths or kind of distinguished holdings of the oral history program?
One of the things I mentioned briefly that I thought was absolutely fascinating was a series of interviews with federal judges. And some of these judges are really important. At least one was a potential Supreme Court nominee. So two of them were on federal courts of appeals. Others are federal district judges. And again, it was fascinating to me to understand how they made decisions, because I would go through the court cases with them and determine how they evaluated testimony and documents, and how do you deal with obstreperous lawyers. What is your method of maintaining control of a court, charges to juries, you know, all of these things that they have to deal with on a daily basis, and it's a complicated system. And so the most difficult interview I did a bankruptcy judge, and I have no idea how they managed to absorb thousands and thousands of documents and somehow make a ruling as to the ultimate outcome of these cases. Two other things that I think were important is a series of interviews with the Water Management District. Water is going to be, in some ways, a crucial issue in this state. And it's fascinating to see how this system evolved in the last 30 years or so, and the responsibility and the issues that water management districts face today. We did a really interesting series of interviews on the restoration of the Everglades and what had gone wrong and what needed to be fixed, the influence of the Corps of Engineers and politics, and that's, again, I think, important. And that tied into a series of interviews we also did about the environment and about growth management. And we've talked to a lot of people influential in the state about how to deal with this growth and what is the responsibility of the state, how can we control growth, how can we make sure there's enough water. And so those were, I think, really important issues in this state. It was more difficult for me because I knew less about the scientific aspects of water management and Everglades, but I again thought these were important interviews. Interviewed a bunch of business leaders in the state. The guy who started Rite Aid, Wayne Huizenga, John Dasberg, who was head of Northwest Airlines. When I interviewed him, he was the CEO of Northwest Airlines and graduate of the university, and later Burger King, and a lot of people who have had great success in the business world. And again, it's such a totally different environment from my academic experience, you know, to talk to somebody like Wayne Huizenga, who I guess is one of the 100 wealthiest people in America, who had on the top of his building had his helicopter that took him to one of his 2 Lear jets, and he lives in this extraordinary environment where he has millions and millions and millions of dollars to play with and invest, and to understand the mindset of these people, which is so totally different from, the academic world. And he talked about forming Blockbuster. And he went, some guy in Arizona, California, I can't remember, I just started, had about 10 of these things. Videos were just coming in. He looked at this and he immediately said, this is a good idea. I want to build 20,000 immediately. And he was opening a Blockbuster every 18 hours. So he had this vision. He saw immediately the potential for this thing. So he was going to open 2 more. He was going to do thousands all over the world. And again, it's fascinating to talk to people like this guy who started Rite Aid. He ended up with 3,000 drugstores. He figured out a system, how it works, how to expand it, and then he just did it. And so that's interesting to me. I've interviewed all of the governors up to Lawton Childs, who died before I could get to him, and I did not get to interview Jeb Bush, but particularly Bob Graham and Reuben Askew have long been considered as some of the most successful governors in American history. And so these are very important. Florida's a huge influential state. And so to talk to them about their experiences was fascinating. That was more appealing to me because I do Southern politics, so I have a little more background, a little more knowledge about that. And the other thing that we've done in terms of our collection, we have had interns who have come in and have created their own projects. And I found that to be extremely valuable. One student did Black Korean POWs, African Americans who had been POWs in the Korean War. We've had a Vietnamese student come and do interviews with Vietnamese who had come to this country after the war and who had been successful in business or assimilation. Same thing with Cuban women, same thing with Filipinos. So we've done some of this cultural immigration history. We've done a series of interviews with the police department in St. Augustine to see how it's changed from the period of the 1960s where there were race riots. And it turns out, based on this interview, that it hadn't changed at all. There was not one single African American on the police force in the year 2003, which I thought was rather unusual. And we've had all these. We did a series of interviews with the FCAT, this Florida Comprehensive Exam that all students have to take to judge their progress. And so this student interviewed people who had to give it, people who took it, and one of the individuals who designed it. And so we've been getting all of these fascinating kinds of extra interviews because of the interest and the focus and the diligence of interns or graduate students. One of our graduate students did a series of interviews about flea markets, which is an important sort of underground economy. A lot of people are involved in these things, and it wouldn't have been something that would have come immediately to my mind as a project. And of course, we have Dan Simone, who's doing an oral history and a dissertation on NASCAR racing, which has become increasingly important. So I like that idea of having graduate students and interns do a broad array of interviews on material and individuals that we wouldn't have time to do, or the interest to do, or the knowledge to do. Now, they're limited because they only do 4 or 5 or 6 interviews, so it's not a broad-based thing, but it does provide you with information and some sense of why these events or people are important, like the FCAT. Some of the stuff that was given to this student is pretty remarkable, considering one of the principals and one of the teachers thought essentially it was a total waste of their time in terms of actually educating the students. And so these are somewhat isolated opinions, but nonetheless interesting because it gives you some insight into what goes on. So that's what I think makes the program interesting. And then we have a lot of interviews that were done prior to my arrival. African American midwives, Florida Highway Patrol, on and on and on. So, I mean, now we have over 4,000 interviews and probably, I don't know, 120,000 pages of transcripts. And the most important thing that I've done since I've been here is to get all of this digitized so people can use it. It's online, it's available, it's accessible. And of course, we want people to use these resources. So in that sense, I think we've expanded the reach of this program, because I know people all the time are using these resources. We get lots of hits on our digital, and we're not quite finished with all of it, but we've come a long way.
Dr. Pleasant, some scholars see oral history as part of a public service or a way to improve civic engagement. Can you comment on that? Oral history is a...
Yes, and in fact, when we started, when I was first hired, the dean told me, he said, this is a state university. We provide service to the citizens of this state, and we want the resources of this collection not only available to them to use, but make them aware of it. And so I see a strong sense, in my view, of what this program should do is this civic responsibility. For example, this 2000 Florida recount. I think we've got information in there that's really not found anywhere else, and it helps people understand what went on, how the result ended up like it did, who was involved, what it means as a citizen to vote. And we know what the election count was in the state of Florida. You couldn't imagine out of 6 million votes it would be that close, but that's what happened. And so that is something that we have tried to do. And in fact, the publications came about mainly as a result of the dean saying, look, you got all these great collections. Let's get some of this material out, get it into books or get it into articles that are directly attributed to and come from the oral history program. So I see that as a vital part of our agenda.
How has the oral history program changed over the years that when you first arrived and as you became director? What have been some of the major, I guess also continuities, but also changes? Biggest
change, obviously, is when I got here is we, and as I've indicated, it was difficult for Sam Proctor to get the money and the resources. And so when I came on board, I think there were 4 people working here. As of last year, we had about 15 people working here and had all of these different projects, had a lot of volunteers, had a lot of students, had interns. That's one of the things I started was the intern program, so we have one every semester. We got a lot more graduate students involved in the program than had been in the past, and we expanded our space. They started out with 1 office, and now we have, I think, 8 offices in this building, and of course our new facilities will double the space we have here. And so the collection has grown, the number of people using the collection has grown, and the number of people working in the collection have grown, and it's become much more diverse. As I indicated, Proctor essentially did interviews with the University of Florida. And so we've tried to expand beyond that and to get information that would be more valuable and useful to people in the state. And the other thing that I have done that he did not do, partly because he was so busy, I have gone around the state and conducted a lot of workshops and have consulted with individuals and groups in doing oral history project, Florida Humanities Council, working with the state, trying to be at least proactive about expanding oral history in the state. And one of the things that we did that was rather important. Initially, the state of Florida, the Historical Society, gave grants for historical preservation. And the grants were limited to physical buildings or documents or some signage that would indicate an important event or individual. And oral history was not included, therefore we were not eligible for grants. So fortunately, a state senator from here, George Kirkpatrick, and I went to him and I said, George, we need to change the law and put oral history in there. And so I got a call from him one day, he said, I'm on the floor of the Senate. I'm amending this bill. This is what I'm going to add, see if this is okay. And it was, and so we added that in, and that's made a huge difference because now oral history is eligible for these grants. So I think that even at the state level, they've become much more aware of the importance of oral history. And now around the state, there are quite a few oral history programs. There's one at Miami, there's one at FSU, one at West Florida, one at South Florida. None of them as large as we are, but that was part of the expansion of oral history in the state. And I have gone around and talked to all these people, and at one time we had a Florida Oral History Association, and we had a few meetings and we had exchange of information, but it sort of ultimately the man who was elected president of that organization unfortunately didn't carry out his responsibility. It kind of died out. But it's an idea that for the future might be possible. But I thought it was a good attempt to try to coordinate all the activities of the oral history program so we weren't duplicating what other oral history programs, and we were sharing information. And so it seems to me that in that context, that was, even though it failed, was a good attempt. And at least everybody got to know each other, and we've communicated and gotten involved. So that's a pretty dramatic change in the last 10 or 11 years.
As a director of one of the premier oral history programs in the country, what have been some of the biggest challenges that you have faced over the years?
The biggest challenge, of course, always money. And the university has never really funded this program adequately. So the way we've had to make money is by grants. And one of the first things I did was to hire a grant writer. So the money for the Seminole project came from a grant. And just try to raise money from private sources, and we've been fairly successful in that. But where most of our money has come is contracts. So for example, the Everglades, we had a contract with the Department of Interior. The Water Management District, that contract was around $100,000. And that enables us to hire more transcribers, researchers, whoever we need. The university has given us a full-time secretary. Previously, we had operating expenses, but because of the budget crisis this year, we got no money for operating expenses. We didn't get OPS money that we'd gotten in the past that enabled us to hire people. And so over a period of time, we have literally had to generate our own funding. And so that's been a challenge. The other challenge, I think, has been to get this program recognized not only on the campus, but in the state and around the country. And I think in that area, we have not done as well as we should have. Particularly on this campus, there are a lot of people that don't even know we exist. And people in the history department don't know what we do. I think that will change now that we have these new quarters and you're going to be coming as a new director. I think that this is going to give us sort of a reinvestment of our commitment to becoming well-known all over the country. And I tried to go to national meetings and things like that, but that's limited. You really need to make this program well-known all over the state. And in some categories, we are. Others, we have not done as well as we should have. So those were, to me, the two biggest challenges.
Dr. Pleasants, you just recently announced your retirement after decades of service and academic scholarship. What kind of impact has being director of the oral history program had on you, both personally and as a scholar?
As a scholar, I hesitate to use this word in the pure academic sense, but I have done research and written books, as I indicated earlier, with material from this program. So that is not the kind of hardcore research that historians normally do, but it is oriented toward oral history. But that has, to some degree, helped me in publishing more books and more articles and that sort of thing. And I've liked that. It has impacted me personally because I have thoroughly enjoyed the challenge of learning new things about the Seminoles or water management. It's really been fascinating to me to interview, and I told everybody about interviewing Pete Peterson, who was a POW for 6.5 years, and interviewing Congressional Medal of Honor winners and Holocaust survivors, and to get these incredibly poignant, fascinating stories from people who've gone through horrendous experience. I interviewed 2 guys who were on the Bataan Death March, and the power of these stories, the emotional level of these stories is just absolutely extraordinary. And it really heightened my sense of history and my desire to learn. And so I have really enjoyed that challenge of learning about new things and talking to lots of different people, from newspaper people to federal judges, you know, the guy who's in charge of the local water management district, people like that, all different walks of life, and all different attitudes, ideas, and it fascinates me. And the other thing that I have enjoyed probably as much as anything, I've been very fortunate to have had Roberta Peacock and these fabulous volunteers who you met, and we've had wonderful success in graduate students and interns. In 12 years, I think I've had to dismiss 2 people. Otherwise, it is a great working relationship. We have a good time. Roberta maintains this sort of family atmosphere. We meet frequently, and we go to lunch, and we have birthdays, and it really helps integrate the individuals, even who are undergraduates, with the graduates, with the older volunteers, and the faculty. And so to sort of meld all these people into a unit has been very satisfying to me. Made a lot of good friends, and we still, what I enjoy more than anything else, is people who work for us stay in contact, and we stay in contact with them, and they let us know what they're doing and how they're progressing. And I think that is as much a pleasure for me, a fulfillment, to have strong friendship with all the people who've worked here. So it's not just somebody who comes in and stays a semester and off they go. We tend to have long-term relationships with these people. So that's been very fulfilling for me.
Dr. Pleasants, what are your hopes for the future of the program?
Well, I think we have, at this juncture, a solid foundation. As we mentioned earlier, the new facilities are wonderful. That will help us. The relationship with the new Graham Center will be very productive. We've got a dynamic, new, capable director coming in. We've got, I think, strong support from the history department, and we have had strong support from the college. And I think that this program can be one of the 4 or 5 best programs in the country. I don't think we'll ever get to where Columbia is, but I think the potential here is great. The good news about a new director is a new director will have new projects, a different focus, different ideas, and you sort of rekindle this interest in what the program is capable of doing. And the fact that you're going to want to teach a graduate history course and oral history and do different things from what I've done, I think gives us renewed energy. And so I think it's a strong base. Sam Proctor left me a good program, and I think we've made it stronger, and then I see it progressing even beyond that. And it's the problem always with a university is funding. But I still see with the importance of oral history that we can achieve success on our own, that we don't always have to depend on university funding, which is good because it is frequently not there. And the system, in its throes of budget problems, is going to give money to programs that they consider more important. And so some of these more peripheral programs are going to get left out. And I think we're still strong enough that we can generate our own funding and continue to improve, even if we don't get what we should get from the university.
Dr. Pleasants, I know that Senator Bob Graham has had an interaction with the oral history program over the years. I wonder if you could speak about Senator Graham's interaction with the oral history program, but then also his importance to the state of Florida.
Well, let me take part B of that. Obviously, he was in the State House, State Senate, 2-term governor, 3-term United States Senator. So he has this extraordinary record of service to his state, something like 34 years, and did a tremendous job as governor and an excellent job as a United States Senator representing his state. He's a man of integrity, extraordinary intelligence, a very bright guy, superb politician, obviously, but more of a statesman than a politician. So I have a great deal of admiration and respect for him. And the relationship began with oral history because he took a course with Sam Proctor as an undergraduate and was impressed by Sam. And so when Sam started the oral history program very early on, he persuaded Graham to come and start giving a series of interviews. And so Graham did a series of interviews about his early life, state senate, governor, U.S. Senate, and then when Sam retired, I took up the interviews. So we currently have, I don't know, 1,200 pages of interviews with Bob Graham, and the interviews are terrific. They're thoughtful, they're insightful, they're articulate. I mean, they're really good interviews that have a tremendous amount of knowledge about the state of Florida, but also the United States government, the United States Senate. It's really a valuable asset to this university. And so when he retired from the Senate, we helped persuade him to give not only his papers to the university, but to go along with his oral history. So we will have both of those together, and eventually they'll be housed in the Graham Center. And so with Graham on campus promoting public policy, it's a great opportunity for the oral history program to interact with him and the Graham Center, and that's something he appreciates and he understands the importance of is oral history. So he's been a huge help to us, particularly in getting us in this new Pugh building and helping us get these really fabulous quarters that we're going to be occupying. So he's been a very good friend and a very strong supporter. And when he was in the Senate, when we needed things, we'd get in touch with him and he'd help us out, and periodically he'd want us to do things for him, information about the state of Florida, and so, we would reciprocate and try to get him information that he needed for a certain bill or for a talk he had to make. So it really kind of worked well on both sides.
This is a question I always hate to get, but I'll have to ask you the question anyway. What has been so far up to this point your favorite, most memorable interview?
It would be, without question, Pete Peterson, who was this POW for 6.5 years. And I interviewed him at the State Department. He had just been appointed the first American ambassador to Vietnam. His new office was about 6 blocks from the Hanoi Hilton, where he had been tortured all those years. And I thought it was pretty remarkable that a guy who had been tortured, and it was extraordinary how he withstood this torture for 6.5 years. I mean, that is an unbelievable amount of time to survive. And so the interview was done with him, and it was absolutely matter of fact. And he talked about being shot down and being tortured and how he was tortured and how they fought back, and they had a tap code so they could interact with other people. He talked about being in prison with John McCain. And the question I asked him was, how do you survive 6.5 years? How do you mentally and physically survive all these beatings and all these torture? And he said, I really don't know. And then he started explaining it in a way. He said, well, I'm a Catholic, I have great faith, I'm a patriot, I was well trained, I was in good physical condition, I was 10th of 12 kids, I sort of learned to fend for myself. And he said ultimately it was a mindset that he was not going to give in. And all of this was matter of fact, without any emotion at all, until he talked about coming back to the United States the first time he saw the American flag. That got him. There's a little emotional shift at that moment. And I said, do you have any regrets? None whatsoever. I was a combat pilot. I was shot down. I was tortured. He said, only thing I'm angry about is that they didn't tell my wife and family that I was alive. And I said, how could you go back and be an ambassador to people who torture? He said, once I left the camp, I left all animosity and anger behind. He said it was done. You can't live your life hating people. And he said, I thought it was such a great opportunity to go back and heal these relationships between this country and the United States. And, we were sitting in the State Department around all these boxes we were sitting on boxes doing this interview because he was getting ready to take up his post. And of course, I talked to him about the Vietnam War Memorial. He said, I go every day because the State Department obviously is right very close to the Vietnam War Memorial. And I just somehow that interview of how he survived and what it all meant to him and how he could somehow forgive people and take up a post with a totally new attitude. Somehow the essence of that interview just has always stayed with me. I just thought it was a remarkable interview. And that's the first time he'd ever talked about it. And right after that, he ended up going on 60 Minutes. It was a long interview in, I don't know, Newsweek or something. I mean, once he had talked to me about it, then somehow or another it was easier for him to talk to other people about it. And those kinds of interviews, the Holocaust victims and people who were on the Bataan Death March, it's just hard to imagine how you can survive the Bataan Death March. I mean, it's a tale of courage and commitment and the ability of these individuals to mentally overcome these extraordinary situations. I asked one of these guys, I said, how did you survive all this? He was in a Japanese prison for 3 years. He said, I wasn't going to let them get me. Just that simple. I said, was it your religion? No. Patriotism? No. family, no, what was it? I wasn't going to let them get me. That simple. And I mean, to me, that kind of environment, those kind of people who've gone through these extraordinary experiences, they're the interviews I remember most vividly.
Dr. Pleasants, it sounds, as the way you describe oral history, it sounds to me that oral history helps us understand really what it means to be fully human.
Yes, very good. Absolutely. And you get that in different contexts as you go. Politicians and judges and water management people have a different view of the world, but all of them have this universal view of humankind. And the water management people, they see water as this precious commodity that we need to survive, and they understand how important it is, and politicians in their own way do. Everybody sort of looks at it in that, and the Seminole Indians who see the world in a vastly different point of view than the rest of us, but the humanity, that element, and their talk about family and history and culture and pride of being a Seminole, all of that comes together with the way you express it. I think it is part of the mass humanity, and that's why oral history is fascinating, to interview all these people at different levels, at different positions, different experiences. And you get them all together, and it does give you this broad cross-section of humanity. It really does, and I think that's what appeals to me more is the human element, as opposed to somebody explain to me how they're going to improve the oxygen content of water. I mean, that's too technical. The issues that are relevant for me are these more human issues and emotions and commitment to country or job or family or whatever it might be. And that's what makes it come alive. That's where the drama is.
Dr. Pleasants, what's next for you? I mean, no one expects you to have an inactive retirement. What do you plan in terms of your academic and personal life?
That's a good question. I'm planning to retire to the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, which is where I went to school and near where I grew up. And so I presumed that I would work with the oral history program there some as a volunteer, and there are probably some research projects I would be interested in. The thing I would probably most like to do at this point, I'm not sure exactly what the specifics are, I'd like to do volunteer work for some charitable organization. Guardian ad litem is something that I'm interested in. But I've sort of been so busy to this point, I haven't had a chance to sit down and be very specific in planning. I do have one book in the back of my mind that I think I'd like to work on. But you don't know what you do in terms of retirement until you sort of get there. And so I'm not sure how I will deal with free time. And I may be bored to tears in a week. And so I'm not sure how I'm going to accommodate to these new challenges. It's going to be a hard transition for me, I think. You know, once you've done something for a long time, you've been busy at it, you enjoy it, then all of a sudden you stop doing it. There are a lot of things I will not miss, grading exams, for example, but there are a lot of things I will miss. And so the collegiality of this office and our faculty members that interact, I'll miss students, miss that interaction, and that's going to be impossible to replace.
All right, well, thank you for taking time out from your schedule to talk with me this morning.
Thank you very much.